officers, but
This is the generals.
this is the general.
General soldier.
General soldiers here.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
6 bunks on either side.
12 people，这就是他们睡的板床，哎，这个你看12张床，哎，是木板，1、2、3，4、5、6，7、8、9，10、11、12，一个这个房子里面睡12个当兵的，他们当年大概就是这么个样子，哎，就这么个样子，哎，这是啊。这个甚至班长也在这儿啊，兵和班长。
So for survival's sake, their families have no other choice. They have to come along.
然后我们再看一个当官的，当官的这都是自己出钱住，自己雇奴隶来伺候自己。哇 ，This one is much better. 这个是 Who will lead the way? Commissioned officers. 这就是他们高级军官的住宅，哎，里面睡个看不见这个啊，里面睡个人，一个人睡，它还有放马鞍的地方，还有个小桌子，还有个小镜子。这个人，就是这个人在这儿住着。然后他还有个两个人住这儿，两个人住在这儿，军官的，但是刚才说了，这些军官呢，他们都是自己出钱。自己带自己的 slave 来伺候自己，自己来这个买武器，所以他们这个打仗不仅是有自己生命危险，最后把家里的钱也花光了。所以好多人独立战争打赢了，最后自己要不然把命丢了，要不然把钱花光了。
Yes, Pennsylvania is very rich in that comes into the Schuylkill River. But the British do come through here on their way to take over Philadelphia, and they destroy the industry here, partly because the forges are illegal, and they get intelligence that Washington also has a lot of tools and supplies stored here in Valley Forge in the industrial village for the Army. So on their way to Philadelphia, they confiscate and destroy all of the supplies, as well as then they destroy the industry here. Yeah. Yeah, sure. But thanks for bringing that up.
Schuylkill?
Schuylkill, yeah, it's an old Dutch word. Originally, some of your original explorers back in the 1500s, 1600s here in Pennsylvania were the Dutch. And so the Dutch are coming through, and Pennsylvania was densely forested. And they're exploring and surveying. They get in this area and they come across, in the midst of this dense forest, a large river. And so Schuylkill in Old Dutch means secret or hidden river. Because kill means river, and then the Schuylkill, which is how they should say it. I can't even say it right. The Dutch people that have been on my tours are trying to get you. It's like, and they're like, that's how in World War I and II they could tell whether they had German spies, because that was one of the few kinds of things that they couldn't pronounce. That they could have perfect Dutch, which a lot of them do know how to speak, but they get found out because they couldn't say that, the SCH sound.
Are any of these the original wood or no?
No, none of these would be. Think of those 18 farms. After we ruin this,
But
their
that one
farm for
looks like
6 months, they're going to have to, they want their farmland back.
That one looks like it's the oldest.
That's there's getting to be some of the older ones up here that they'll probably be the next ones to be replaced. Obviously, these three here.
But the idea is the
as
same.
of October of last
But the
year.
idea is the same.
And they were already 70 years old. These that are falling apart here are from the 1950s.
Oh, okay.
So now it's time to, when the park
been
or
here
the
this
Park
long,
Service
huh?
gets enough money together, those will be the next ones to be replaced.
Were the farmers paid? The 18 farmers?
That's a good question. For the most part, no, because we don't have that kind of money. Even the British Army, when they're having a large encampment, they don't have that kind of money either for land rental. What Washington does to differ from what the British are notorious for doing, and part of the grievances in the Declaration of Independence is no forcible quartering of troops in times of peace or land, and that's also our Third Amendment to the Constitution. That's how important that was. So what Washington did is every time you use somebody's personal, like part of their home or a barn or maybe some of their livestock, he would get permission from the owner and then pay a fair rent for it. So when you see the headquarters building, he pays 100 Pennsylvania pounds for that. So in Pennsylvania currency, he's paying basically a year's salary of a skilled worker for the rental of the furniture and the house and the property there. So fair rental, and it was available because it was part of the industrial village of Valley Forge, and it was British already destroyed everything before they on their way to take over Philadelphia. So.
Speaking of money paid, were these soldiers, when they were stationed here, were they still working under the promise of pay, or were they getting?
They're supposed to be getting paid $6 2/3 a month, which was a pretty good wage back then. Sometimes there was the issue with Congress. They had control of the purse strings like they do today for the military, and so sometimes they were getting their pay, sometimes they weren't, based on supply. Also, Congress is the money, the Continental script that they are printing isn't backed up by anything. There's not a lot of faith in it. And then they keep printing more, so you can just see what that's doing. The inflation's through the roof. So yeah, we have an issue with supply line and money off and on. Also, at this point in the war, now that we're trying to keep our army together, so the 3 years contracts or the duration of the war, part of the incentives of bringing guys on as soldiers is if you stick out the whole thing and we win this war, you get a promissory note of 100 acres of land, which would be in what is today the Midwestern United States. So that's a big incentive, since a lot of people still don't own their own land or their own businesses, especially for some of these younger men who aren't going to, even if their families do own land and business, they have no promise of inheriting any of it, because most of the time in this society, it's going to all go to the oldest son and everybody else, and they have big families. So if you're like not the oldest, you get nothing. So that's a big incentive for, hey, we're going to stick this thing out, because if we can get our own land, we can start our own business, our own farms, that kind of thing, and have a promise of creating wealth. So everybody has seen these two, and then, like I said, come back afterwards. Burgers, and I say that partly in jest, and also Washington had a huge admiration for his general soldiery, that they did not, under these horrific challenges and living conditions at the beginning of this encampment, that they do not en masse desert like you would expect. Other thing that you're going to see as we go around today, and as you drive around on your own of the park, is you're going to see monuments with different state names on them. Here's what's happening with that. Up until now, there's another thing that Washington needs to change about the Army. Up until now, 3 years into this, and pay attention to what that monument said, and we'll get to that in a second. So, up until now, The Continental Army is made up of 13 professional armies. Each state had its own army, so it's not that these guys are untrained soldiers. They're not. They are professionally trained for the most part. It's that they're trained differently. So it's like putting 13 different playbooks on the same field for the same game, not working too great 3 years in. Washington needs to create one standardized, unified United States Army, and that's what happens here at Valley Forge once von Steuben shows up in February of 1778 and writes a new system specific to these Americans' needs and their mindset. That said, when the state of Pennsylvania is recreating the acreage of this early 20th century, they go out to the original 13 states and they say, send us a monument, we'll put it up in honor of your guys that were here. The one that we just passed that said Maine, that was number 1 to make it to Valley Forge. Maine doesn't become a state until 1820, but they are here. Which one of the original 13 do they belong to? Massachusetts. So back then, Massachusetts is what is today Massachusetts, Maine, and the eastern half of New York State. So when Maine beats Massachusetts with a monument to Valley Forge, Massachusetts has an attitude, and this is what they send. They're like, yeah, take that, Maine. We'll show you guys. You were part of us at the time. So where you see these state monuments is where the bulk of that state's army would have been encamped. So this would have been a lot of Massachusetts troops. We're about to come up on the National Memorial Arch. We're going to pull around to the other side of it. Al's going to line up a really nice photo opportunity for you. It's the American flag at the center of the National Memorial Arch, and today it should be really a good shot, beautiful. Things to think about. Officers' journals are describing this encampment as a mud city, a smoke city, and a stench city. Local accounts said you could smell this encampment miles before you could see it. And you want to think about what it was like to live inside of it. And we're certainly grateful that the National Park Service didn't try to recreate that feature of living history. So here's where you're going to get the photo opportunity. Since we are full, people on the left-hand side of the trolley help the people on the right-hand side of the trolley to get the shot. And it is right there. Also, people usually often come back here later in the day when the park is kind of cleared out so that you don't get a lot of people in your shot if you want that just by itself. If you're here at twilight time, they do light up the arch at night, and it is very pretty and gives it a whole different effect. This National Memorial Arch is the only monument sent here by the federal government. It's commissioned by Congress in 1910, dedicated here in Valley Forge 1917. The design of this arch is fairly familiar, for there are several designed like this around the world and in this country, and they're all designed after the ancient Roman Arch of Titus. After a conquest, a conquering Roman army would always go back into Rome through that arch. So all of these arches that look like this are memorializing a triumphant, victorious army. Federal government places it here in 1917, Valley Forge, because this is where we become the triumphant, victorious United States Army as we know it today in its present form. The quote on this side of the arch is significant. It is from a letter Washington is writing the governor of New York in February of 1778. This time pretty much Congress is ignoring his pleas for help for this encampment. So he's going out to state governors because they have the control of the state funds, asking for help. And he says, naked and starving as they are, we cannot enough admire the incomparable patience and fidelity of the soldiery. So in one sentence, we're getting a whole lot of information about what it's like to live in this camp and some of the challenges to basically 2 months in. Naked and starving, We're obviously still have a very broken supply line. You saw the bake ovens. We talked about the bread and the fire cake, the flour products that they're living off of. We're just malnourished. They need to get more varieties of food to the soldiers on a regular basis to maintain good health and nutrition. The naked part, 18th century military, you're considered naked or unfit for duty if you don't have the proper footwear or outerwear to do the work of the soldiery. 1/3 of the population of this encampment at the very beginning is naked or unfit for duty. Some of these guys don't have shoes, some of them don't have coats, some of them are selling the shirts off their backs for a little extra food. Some of them are wearing blankets around their waist because they don't have pants anymore. And it's cold, and they're trying to maintain their modesty. It's the 18th century. So you get the idea. So now we have 1/3 less men at the beginning of this encampment building all those huts, building the trench lines, and they still do it as quickly as they do, which is amazing to me. New Hampshire and New York, there's your two monuments there. So a lot of the troops that we just came, as we came around the bend, before that would have been a lot of New Hampshire and New York troops. Right ahead of us, these two columns with the bronze eagles atop. This is the Pennsylvania State Troops monument. So this part of the outer line of defenses would have been a lot of Pennsylvania State troops. So why do we have a broken supply line? Here's what's going on. Beginning of this encampment, a lot of politics. At this time, we've got a very divided Congress and corrupt Congress. Also, some of the upper ranks of this army are corrupt and divided. And the big division is over who should be the commander-in-chief of the army. Obviously, not everybody's a big fan of Washington in that position. Some of them would rather see General Horatio Gates in that position. And then in the fall of he's the one that takes credit for the victory in Saratoga, New York, which occurs October of 1777. Also, fall of 1777, the quartermaster general for this army is General Thomas Mifflin of Pennsylvania. Before I go on, do we know what a quartermaster general does for the army? Head of the entire supply line for the entire army. Mifflin does not like Washington. He also hates his job, so he quits. First week of October of 1777, and Congress does not replace him. We go 5 months without a quartermaster general for this army. Do we see the problem with the supply line at the beginning of this encampment? We don't get a quartermaster general until sometime in March of 1778. Obviously, what they're trying to do to Washington is sabotage his efforts here at Valley Forge, since the bulk of the army is here for the winter. Oh, and by the way, Gates was supposed to send men after Saratoga and supplies to winter with Washington here in Pennsylvania. He refuses because he wants Washington's job. So they're hoping Washington fails miserably here. They'll kick him out, put Gates in. We know that doesn't happen. Washington convinces one of his most loyal generals, General Nathaniel Greene of Rhode Island, to become quartermaster general, and then Congress finally appoints Greene into that position sometime in March of 1778. After that, Greene and Washington do massive reforms to the quartermaster department to make sure this kind of a break never happens again, and we know they were successful. This statue here, this is one of Washington's best generals. This is General Anthony Wayne. Anybody hear of him? If you haven't, look him up. Mad Anthony Wayne, he is incredibly important to early American military history and the expansion of this country in its early years after the Revolution is over. He is the head of the Pennsylvania State Troops here at Valley Forge encampment. He's also very local to this area, so if you look where he's facing on top of his horse, he is looking towards his home, Waynesboro Manor, 6 miles away from here, Malvern, Pennsylvania. That mansion is still standing today, so obviously he is from a very rich family. He's a general, he's got his own horse, beautiful mansion, 6 miles, comfort of home and family. mud, smoke, stench, death, and disease in this camp. To the best of our mansion during this camp. We know that he's using as his headquarters for this camp part of his cousin Sarah Walker's farmhouse. So his cousins are one of those 18 private farms that we're ruining and sitting on top of for this encampment for 6 months. And that's where Wayne's living and administrating. Wayne's also the one who takes over as the head of the United States Army when Washington becomes our first president. And he is credited with accruing a lot of what is today the Midwestern United States. So any location that has a Wayne or some variation of Wayne in its name, there's your guy, and that's why. That's how great of a general he was. He was fierce and very talented. Fort Wayne, Indiana, Wayne, Kentucky, Wayne, Tennessee, Wayne, Pennsylvania, Wayne, New Jersey. There are Wayne counties all over the United States in different states. We've got Waynesvilles, Waynesburgs, Waynesboroughs. Maybe your state has at least one of them. Pennsylvania has all of the above. And then you have Anthony Wayne, this and that, schools and boulevards. That's why Virginians, there's your monument right there. Don't get too excited about it. Little underwhelming, easy to miss, but there it is. Bottom of this hill, there's a monument that we talk about briefly. It's placed here in 1912, Daughters of the American Revolution, Valley Forge chapter. It reads, in memory of unknown soldiers buried at Valley Forge. Operative word in that statement is buried. Often, one of the first questions we get here at Valley Forge after we give the statistic about the high death toll all due to disease here is, hey, where's the cemetery? Not in this camp for the most part. Why? Remember, we're an encampment, not a battlefield. We're not fighting a battle and then burying our dead with honors and moving it on. We're living here in this encampment. We don't know how long we're going to be here. And disease is a huge issue. So Washington's trying to keep this army together as best he can. So for morale of the soldiers, certainly you as a soldier don't want to keep waking up every day, going outside your hut and seeing more and more graves popping up. Not a good way to keep an army together. You might not want to find out if you're the next to become one of those, part of that statistic. So when these guys are getting severely ill, Washington is getting them outside of camp to hospital sites. So he's using at least 29 different hospital sites for this encampment. Some of them are here in the greater tri-state Philadelphia area. We have a lot of church communities, Quakers, Society of Friends, Lutheran, Baptist, Reformed communities. We're also sending them to the Moravians in Bethlehem. That's about 65 miles north of here. Also the Moravians in Lancaster County, Lidditz Moravians, and the Ephrata Cloister, about 60 miles west of here. So wherever the soldier ends up in the hospital, that's where he's probably going to die. That's where they're getting buried. So if you want to see memorials for the and grave sites for Valley Forge soldiers, you have to go to one of those communities that have the hospital sites. Also, if you're dying in this encampment, they're getting those bodies outside of camp several miles and creating mass graves. We have documentation that there is one underneath the King of Prussia Mall. Yeah. This on your left-hand side, we slow down for this farmhouse here, this first one. That was here, one of the 18 farms. Part of that house was used by General Henry Knox, head of Washington's artillery, for his headquarters for this camp. The rest of these structures are from the 1800s. Yep, safety check. So especially people who are sitting in the back right-hand side of the trolley. Be aware that we're now coming off of the outer line defenses. We're about to go into the inner line defenses in the valley. You're going to be getting in close quarters with a lot of tree branches. So just lean over in towards the center to make sure you're not getting bopped with them on the head or getting scratched, anything like that. And then that's also just a general note. At all times, please keep your arms, heads, hands, feet, anything like that inside the trolley at all times. We don't want any injuries. So up the road from this covered bridge, the original covered bridge was placed here in 1861. Up the road from there is where Lafayette had his headquarters and his men encamped, as well as General Lord Sterling. So here we are. These are those two steep hills I was showing you in the beginning at that first stop. This is our inner line of defenses. Mount Misery's on your left, Mount Joy's on your right. After the tour is over, highly recommend you take a drive on West Line Drive. That's going to take you up through the defensive features of Mount Joy. There's still a couple inches of the original earthworks up there. They're designated by bronze plaques. There's also an overlook into a redoubt. Artillery Park is up there, as well as New Jersey's monument. And bottom of the hill, you'll see a monument where Washington's marquee office tent was located approximately before he moves into the headquarters building we're about to tour. Pre-revolution, people were asking me about the iron industry and the iron sources of iron here in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is very rich in iron, and yes, this area here was the original location of the industrial village of Valley Forge. Right here, we would have had two operating iron forges. Valley Creek's running on your left-hand side. That's going to flow into the Schuylkill River over at Washington's headquarters area. One of the defensive natural resource features of this encampment, but for the industrial village, Valley Creek here is housing the mill race, or the hydro or water power for the industry here. The two forges and the sawmill and the grist or grain mills that were on the creek bank right across from the building that becomes Washington's headquarters. By the time Washington gets here at the end of December to set up his winter encampment, this area here is already a ghost town for a good 3 months. War comes to Valley Forge mid-September of 1777. That's the beginning of the Philadelphia campaign. General Sir William Howe's tactic is, if he can take over the rebel capital of Philadelphia and capture our Congress, the war ends quickly. He brings his troops up the Chesapeake Bay at the end of August of 1777, gets off in Elkhead, Maryland, which is northeast Maryland area today, goes into the Wilmington, Delaware area, and then slips into Pennsylvania about 36 miles southwest of here. That's Brandywine. Most people have heard of the Battle of Brandywine, one of the larger battles, if not the largest battle that we fight in this 8-year war. And we're still not standardized and unified as a army, so we lose, and that battle is September the 11th of 1777. So after Brandywine, General Howe throws Washington a curveball. He makes it look like he's headed with the Royal forces towards Reading, Pennsylvania. About 36 miles northwest of here, Washington has a huge ammo depot, cartridge laboratory, and lots of supplies stored for the Army there. Can't let any of that fall into British hands. When General Howe has the Royal forces here in Valley Forge mid-September, he then flanks a good amount of his men due east and heads directly towards our capital city of Philadelphia. Washington obviously can't be in two places at the same time. A group of British cavalry at that time breaks away from the main forces, goes through the industrial village of Valley Forge, confiscates and destroys the many tools and supplies Washington is storing here in Valley Forge, and then they destroy the industry. They burn the two forges, they burn the sawmill, and they blow up the mill race that's powering everything here in Valley Creek. So by the end of September, there's no reason for anybody to still be living here, because there's nothing operating anymore. If it's still standing, it's inoperable. This house is the only one that is left for Washington to rent when he's looking for a headquarters building. I think he's still dealing with that whole split in Congress, and some of his generals aren't for him. He's dealing with that outside of this house down here too. That doesn't get resolved until March of 1778. He's in here since he moves into this house around Christmas Day of 1777. So he's not taking over any or renting any of those, like that larger farmhouse that Knox has and some of the other farms, because he doesn't want to stir up the waters. His job is still in jeopardy. So he takes on this house that's the bottom of this hill over here on your left-hand side. That is the original house. The house becomes open to the public as a museum in 1878, which is why we create a state park starting down here. So this is the original acreage as of 1893. Because of this house, why we have a state park here, there was also a Victorian hotel across the way, and then some of the acreage across the river. The Schuylkill River is right here on our right-hand side. As I said, the house is the original one. What the Rangers asked me to do during this stop is to keep you together as a group, so I will meet you out here in the shade on the train station platform here. Once we have everybody off the trolley and together, we'll walk down.